The Sound of Freedom is a new movie being released in cinemas this week. Now, the film puts a spotlight on child trafficking. Diane Saipe from the organisation Child Rescue works to rescue children from sexual exploitation and human trafficking and helps them to stay free. Today on the show, we're going to talk with Brian about child trafficking and how, even in the midst of such darkness, we can find reason to hope. Brian, thank you so much for being in studio with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Diane, for the opportunity. It's always great to be here.
Now, firstly, you've actually seen The Sound of Freedom a little bit before the rest of us. It certainly does put a spotlight on child trafficking. From what you've seen of the film, how true to reality is it?
Diane, the centrepiece of the movie is the former head of Operation Underground Railroad, Tim Ballard. So this is very personal to him. And when we looked at the movie, it is very, very true to life. And in fact, one of the things that is important here is that unexpectedly, for some people, one of the traffickers is actually female, and that actually coincides with our experience in Thailand and Cambodia, where we find about 70% of the trafficking is done by women.
Wow. Yeah, you wouldn't expect that. So you would say, in terms of this film, it kind of puts the whole industry, if you want to call it an industry, into perspective.
Diane, I think it is an industry, and it does put it into perspective. I remember a statistic that they were quoting in the movie, and they were talking about millions of children being exploited. And I went and checked the data on the global estimates of modern slavery, forced labour and forced marriage, which are put out by the International Labour Organization. It's part of the United Nations. And they reported in 2021 that 27.6 million people were in forced labour. 12% of those in forced labour are children, and more than half of these children are in commercial sexual exploitation. And if you crunch the numbers, that comes to about 1.7 million children, and that was in 2021.
I mean, these are, when you talk about the scale, it just is mind-blowing, to be honest. And, and you look at the scale and you think, can such evil exist in such a big extent? But it does. Has it gotten worse, would you say, over the years? And I'm thinking particularly, we've been through this whole COVID period where so many nations were shut down. But did trafficking continue?
I think you've got to look at the definition of trafficking, because trafficking doesn't necessarily mean moving people around, although it can do. If you go back to the definition of trafficking in persons, which was put out by the UN in around about 1949, the essential elements include the oppression of people for commercial gain. So we found during COVID and since then that there has been an explosion of the online exploitation of young people, and we are working very actively in some countries to combat that.
Now, you say we are working, so let's talk about child rescue and the work that you do. I mean, obviously it's probably changed the way it's done things over the years, like you say, with this different form of exploitation. But yeah, tell us about the nitty-gritty of the work.
It's very hard to actually even absorb the scale of it. But what we know is that technology has accelerated the growth of exploitation of people. We have a colleague who works overseas leading police operations in Thailand, and we also have a memorandum of understanding with the Philippines. And when I say we, I'm talking about Destiny Rescue International, no relation to Destiny Church. It's the organisation that Child Rescue is partnered with and working alongside. And we have worked with those governments to set up hotlines for young people to be able to call and ask for help. And currently the leader of the operation in Thailand, who is an ex-New Zealand policeman, is training large numbers of Thai police in the use of a software suite which to the credit of my Australian colleagues was donated by a firm called Saipe. And this is a software suite that actually processes images faster than human beings can do, and also assists police in tracking the IP address of devices such as smartphones and laptops to find people who are selling children, and they're doing this actually online with live streaming, and also tracking pedophiles who are in different countries from the country of abuse. So that's huge, and it's a very, very important area these days.
I mean, it is huge. And I talked about the fact that it seems a little overwhelming. So when you're in the midst of essentially what is quite dark, can you share a story of hope, a story of light with us today?
I'd like to borrow one from one of my colleagues who was at the time leaving from Bangkok to go to another country. He didn't really want to be there, and he said in his own words, I was having a whinge with God. Damo's Australian. And he was really talking to the Lord about whether or not he was making a difference. And at that moment, he heard his name being called in the darkness. And two young women who he did not recognize initially ran and threw themselves on him, and they had an older couple with them. And he realized at the time that these were two young women who he'd put into a preparatory training course. They'd gone on to qualify as nurses, and they were explaining to him at the time that the reason they were out and about in the very early hours of the morning was because they had just finished their shift at a hospital, and they were so excited to see him, they couldn't stop talking to the other couple that was with them, saying, this is him. This is the man who changed our lives. And he said to us, it was as if this was God's answer to him, saying, see, you really are making a difference.